Old-Fashioned Murder and Mayhem, Love and Murder, William Benson, 1888. The winter sun was setting at the Mottweiler small farm tucked in the valley near Edwardsville, Floyd County, Indiana. It was Sunday evening, December 9th, 1888, and 20-year-old Sally Snyder, heavy with child, was at the spring house when she saw William Benson, 19, approaching her. He had a strange expression on his face. "Well, I did it," he announced nervously. "We can get married now." Sally was confused. "What did you do?" she asked, somewhat frightened by his unusual demeanor. William had been after her to marry him for months. He was a sweet young man, but she was not interested in marrying him despite her embarrassing situation. "I killed them, Uncle Jake and Aunt Ellen," he said. Sally's heart nearly stopped. She just about lost her footing as she stumbled toward the farmhouse. At the barn was her older half-sister, Ellen Mottweiler, who'd raised her from childhood, lying in a pool of blood and spilled milk. Her head had been bashed with the hatchet. William added, "I left Uncle Jake up near the train tunnel. It'll look like vagrants got him." "What have you done?" she screamed. William looked bewildered. "We can get married now," was his reply. Welcome to another episode of Old-Fashioned Murder and Mayhem. I am your host, Mindy Hudson, bringing you tales of scandal and true crime with a twist of genealogy. Today, we will explore the story of love and murder, William Benson, 1888. Jacob Mottweiler, born in 1845, was the son of German immigrant Adam Mottweiler, who arrived in New Orleans in 1836. Adam quickly settled in southern Indiana, in Georgetown near the Kentucky border. He married Elizabeth Roser and had several children who were all productive members of the community. During the Civil War, Jacob Mottweiler served as captain in Company B, 38th Indiana Infantry. He was wounded in battle and later received a pension because of it. Jacob married Mary Ellen Snyder, daughter of Samuel Snyder and Ellen Mayfield. Upon his wife's death in 1850, Samuel Snyder married Elizabeth Gilmore and had 6 more children in addition to the 3 from his first marriage. Unfortunately, Elizabeth also died young, leaving several small children without a mother's care. After many years of marriage, Jacob and Ellen Mottweiler had everything they might desire except children of their own. So they counted it a blessing when Ellen's youngest half-sister, Sally Snyder, came to live with them. Referring to them as Uncle Jake and Aunt Ellen, Sally enjoyed a pleasant childhood, and as the years passed, she grew into an attractive young woman with blonde hair and blue eyes. In the early spring of 1888, Sally met a man by the name of Frank Livingston and fell deeply in love. He made promises of marriage, and at almost 20, Sally found she was pregnant. To her horror, Frank refused to honor his pledge to wed her. She filed a bastardy bond in the court, naming him as the child's father, but he quickly fled the area, never to be seen again. In the meantime, Uncle Jake was made aware of a young man at the county poor farm who was in dire health and needed care. He and Ellen decided to take him in and nurse him back to health, hoping that when he was well, he might help at the farm. William Benson, about 19, had lived with his widowed mother Eliza and brother Charles at the Jefferson County poor farm in Kentucky for most of his life. In June 1888, he was brought to the Mottweiler farm, where he received healthy food and tender care. As he grew stronger, he developed a strong attraction to Sally and began trying to convince her to marry him. William Benson was a nice-looking young man. He had dark hair and gentle eyes, But Sally knew William was uneducated and had no prospects, and she had no attraction to him. To put him down kindly, she told the young man that she had no intention of marrying as long as she was able to live with Uncle Jake and Aunt Ellen. In William's mind, he interpreted her meaning to be that if they were out of the way, the two of them would be free to marry. He was sure the fallen girl wanted him as her husband, but her family was preventing it. On Sunday morning, December 9th, 1888, Jake and Ellen Mottweiler set off to Edwardsville to the Baptist church for the morning service. Afterward, they returned home and sat down with William and Sally for the afternoon meal. Once done, the women got up to clear the table and wash the dishes. Benson asked Uncle Jake if he could talk with him. He told the elder man that he wanted to marry Sally and give the baby a father, and asked him to build a house for them on the property. Uncle Jake patiently tried to explain to the young man that he didn't have the resources to build a house for them, and that he didn't think Sally was interested in the proposal. This enraged Benson, who stood up and sulked away. Chores went on as usual that afternoon, and as the day commenced, Uncle Jake went out to the field near the East Railroad Tunnel, called the Duncan Tunnel of the Louisville, Evansville, and St. Louis Railroad, which emptied near his property, to call the cows for milking. This was his usual habit, as Ellen went into the barn to start the milking. Earlier, William Benson had taken the gun, presumably to go squirrel hunting before dark. In truth, he hid among the trees, waiting. Uncle Jake was on his way back to the house and was reaching into his pocket to pull out a wad of tobacco. He never got his hand out of the pocket. William came up behind him and shot him in the back of the head, killing him instantly. Jake fell over with the top of his head blown off. William left him where he fell and returned to the house. He put the gun away and headed to the barn, grabbing the hatchet on the way. He found Aunt Ellen seated on a stool milking. She didn't even turn around before he struck her in the back of the head with the hatchet, then struck her again with the handle. Thinking she was dead, he headed to the spring house to find Sally. He expected her to be overjoyed at the news, but she didn't react that way. She was mortified and in shock. She ran toward the house, her heavily pregnant belly causing her to gasp with every step. She ran to the barn where she found her sister lying in the dirt with her bright red blood mingling with the spilled milk. "William, help me get her to the house," she begged. But Benson put his hands in his pockets and leaned against the barn. Sally struggled to drag Ellen to the house by herself. Then she ran a half-mile to the nearest neighbor, Frank Gresham, who fetched Mace Wheeler, and both men returned to the Mottweiler property. Mrs. Mottweiler was still alive, but her skull was crushed in 2 places, and it seemed impossible she could survive very long. Benson made no effort to flee. In fact, he told the men where they could find Jacob Mottweiler almost a mile from the house. They examined the body and realized Mottweiler was already deceased. William Benson followed them as if he were helping them with the discovery. They decided to leave the body where it was and stood guard over it during the night. The men later stated that it was eerie how Benson sat up with them through the night as they waited for daylight to call the coroner and sheriff. When Coroner Starr and Constable Payton arrived, Benson admitted he shot Jacob Mottweiler, but claimed it was an accident. He was hunting for squirrels when the gun accidentally discharged. Uncle Jake had stepped in front of him and was killed. When he saw what he had done, he panicked and beat Aunt Ellen with the hatchet. Benson was taken in for questioning, but when he learned that Sally had told them he had murdered the couple to gain their property, he said she'd been in on it too. He said they'd been planning the murder for some time. They had wanted to marry, and her family refused to let them. According to Benson, Sally said that while they were alive, she'd never marry. He believed that when the couple got out of the way, the farm would belong to Sally, and they would be set. He also claimed Sally had been the one to beat Aunt Ellen with a hatchet. With that accusation, Sally was also arrested. But it didn't take long with the inconsistencies in Benson's story to realize she was innocent, and she was released. Remarkably, Ellen Mottweiler lingered. She was insensible for months and could not attend Jacob's funeral. Following the trauma, Sally Snyder gave birth 5 days later to a baby girl, Edna Laura Snyder. Following a change of venue due to the overwhelming sentiment of anger over the crime in Floyd County, William Benson's trial was held in Clark County, Indiana, in April 1889. Sally Snyder came with her baby daughter wrapped in her arms. She testified that she had never encouraged Benson to believe she would marry him, and that it was all a fantasy in his mind. Ellen Mottweiler recovered well enough to attend the trial. Her badly disfigured face was a stark reminder of the vicious attacks she had endured, and she had to walk with the aid of a cane. She testified about her belief that William had been planning to murder them for several weeks. She recalled that sometime earlier in the fall he was driving her home in the buggy, and as they topped a high hill, his recklessness caused her to insist he let her out to walk down the hill. He allowed her to exit, but came back up the hill with a frightening expression on his face. Mrs. Mottweiler said she asked him what he was doing, and he answered that the horse threw a shoe and he had come back to find it. She remembered laughing and reminding him the horse hadn't been shod in some time, and asked why he was acting so foolishly. She thought now that he had planned to murder her that day. Benson's mother, a frail woman, sat stoically in the courtroom observing, but tried not to attract attention to herself. His older brother Charlie was with her. It didn't take long for the verdict to be reached, and William Benson was sentenced to hang in August 16, 1889. Still angry that Sally had rejected him, he wrote a confession just before his scheduled execution, insisting that she was complicit in the crimes. As the date drew near, it seemed impossible that there would be a reprieve despite the letters written on his behalf by his mother and himself. Benson's letter, filled with spelling and grammatical errors, read as follows, quote, Governor Hovey, I write this to ask you to commute my sentence from death to imprisonment for life, if you please. My mother and brother and friends are living, and I would like to live too, for I am young, and my life is sweet to me. And if you will grant me this favor, that will be all I will ever ask of you. From William Benson to Governor Hovey, July 21st, 1889, end quote. There was a counter petition signed by many members of the jury and members of the GAR who'd served with Jacob Mottweiler during the war, asking Governor Hovey to allow the execution to stand. Nevertheless, at about 8 p.m., August 15th, just hours before the hanging, a proclamation signed by the governor commuted the sentence to life in prison, citing Benson's underprivileged life and lack of intelligence surely contributed to his rash act. People were outraged, stating that if anyone deserved the death penalty, William Benson surely did. He had murdered and maimed the people who had taken him from poverty, nursed him back to health, and given him a chance at a good life. But there was nothing to be done. He was transferred north to the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City, LaPorte County, Indiana, where he lived out the rest of his life. Ellen Mottweiler moved to Georgetown, Indiana, to be cared for by her brother-in-law, George Mottweiler, and wife. She was able to draw a pension on Jacob's Civil War service. She walked with a cane and wandered about the town telling folks that she was, quote, unquote, hunting for Jake. Sally Snyder moved to Kentucky for a while, but later returned to New Albany, Floyd County, Indiana. In the 1900 census, Sally's daughter Edna was living with the family of Sally's older sister, Laura Bell, and husband James Toops in Floyd County. Sally married Robert Lee Tucker in 1905, but divorced him soon after. Edna married Ollie C. Morga in May 1909. The year 1910 wiped out the remaining family. Edna Snyder Morga died March 12th from tuberculosis. Sally Snyder Tucker died October 20th from intestinal obstruction. And Ellen Snyder Mottweiler died December 20th of valvular disease. William Benson applied for a pardon in 1910. It was granted a couple of days after Ellen's death. According to newspaper articles, he married 19-year-old Dolly B. Robbins in LaPorte, Indiana, July 6, 1911, and had 3 children. She died in Montgomery County, Indiana, in November 1917. No further information about the children has been located. Benson was returned to prison on a parole violation 4 years later, in June 1914, when he was accused of mistreating 2 little girls in the LaPorte neighborhood where he lived. He commented that he was unable to cope with the outside world and was glad to return to prison. When he died, September 12, 1941, at age 78, he was the oldest prisoner at the Indiana State Prison and had served the longest term. His prison number was number 366. He is buried in the Indiana State Prison Cemetery. Thank you for listening to the story of love and murder, William Benson. See the description box below for more information on resources used to construct this and other historical true crimes. If you enjoy this type of content, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. For suggestions or questions, please contact Mindy Hudson at melindamaloo@gmail.com. Join me again next month for another episode of Old-Fashioned Murder and Mayhem.